Welcome to Sean's Thoughts. I hope you're having a wonderful day today. I definitely am. Today is Sunday, May 17th. And, you know, there's been a lot of things that I have been working towards and experiencing and essentially looking to experience. And, well, today I've decided to perhaps share some of the ideas that I have derived from, the books that I love to read. Often I say that, leaders are readers, and this is a phrase that I heard from or that I learned from a former mentor of mine. And I truly do believe that reading knowledge is definitely important to the aspect of growth and the aspect of, reaching for what's beyond the known because when we're caught in that daily routine of doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results, we sometimes, miss the opportunities to, just sit down and relax and enjoy something. And I don't necessarily mean enjoy that thriller or that horror novel where we have to, read what others did that we would ourselves never participate in, but yet to read books that inspire and influence and perhaps even teach. And not necessarily that we have to accept everything that we're reading, yet we allow it to, come in and through our discernment, allow for what wisdom and knowledge there is. And so today we're joined, or you're joining me, at the Haney House in Maple Ridge. This is a rather large house that was built as an estate, perhaps 160 acres, apparently, from what I read on the little plaques. And it was built prior to the 1900s. Now, that was a very long time ago, and yet this house definitely withstands the test of time. I'm unfortunately unable to get it all into a single frame, but yet, you know, on the thumbnail, there is a picture that I have taken, and you can see definitely an interesting piece of architecture, I'd say. A building that has, as I said, withstand the test of time. One of the things that I noticed immediately about this building is the actual doors themselves, the entrance to the door down here just above the patio, as well as the one on the patio above. They're pretty short. That's an interesting observation I made. But yet, in a time of all times, perhaps back in that time, we were all perhaps different. And I keep using all of these words, perhaps and maybes and what ifs. And yet I do that in order to keep myself open to the possibility that, things weren't necessarily the way that we imagined it. And so this particular house was one of the original landowners that came to Maple Ridge. He was a master bricklayer, as it said on the plaque. And, he contributed a lot to the overall construction of Maple Ridge. And Maple Ridge, perhaps, at that time it wasn't called Maple Ridge. I believe it may have been called Haney, like named after the people. One of the things that I had learned during my trip across Canada is that a lot of the places that we once had names for, that they're named after people or families per se that, took up roots within that area, became the farmers on that road, and therefore that road was named after them. My family name Pederson, actually, when I was driving through and across Canada, I came across a road called Peterson Road. So I recognized that instantly as that perhaps that's where some of my family lineage had come from. And all across, the English speaking world, everything always seems to be named after something that perhaps those people are the ones who laid those roots down. And eventually, as society grew, we changed the name. And yet, structures such as this still continue to exist. And as I said, this is called the Haney House, and it's in Maple Ridge, and it's a pretty old house, or at least a replica or a matrix rendition of the house that perhaps lived here at one point in time. Anyways, thank you for joining me. I know that was a long intro, but I kind of wanted to, set up the idea of what I'm planning on doing today, and also, share a little with you about the location which I share with you today. 150 perhaps year old house, almost as old as what they claim Canada to be as a country. And so, welcome. to Sean's Thoughts. Today, I'm going to share with you some of the reading that I was discussing with you about. Actually, before I jump into the frame, I kind of want to bring the images of those books into it because it'll be closer. But there has been a series of books that I have been, investigating, researching, reading, investing a lot of my time in because I found them to be quite informative when it comes to help perhaps getting me or at least my consciousness into alignment with, the attributes and the harmony of love, of compassion, of, freedom, sovereignty, and such, rather than being connected to those old traditional ways of how things had to be in the past. And this particular book series, which is channeled by a man named Paul Selig, it's a 12 book series currently, and it actually is pretty interesting. And I've essentially, as I've mentioned before, read through and listened to most of the books almost a dozen times a piece. And the one that I'm currently reading is actually called A World Made New. And I'm going to bring that into the camera if it comes in. Yeah, there it is. So that's the book that I'm currently reading, and I read part of it this morning. And today, though, I want to read a little bit from the first book. And, this book was a book that I found on Kevin Trudeau's top 100 book list, and it was actually book number 89 at the time. I'm not sure what it is or if it's even there now, but I found this book as well as, some of his other books on that book list. And immediately I decided that I had to jump past a lot of those other more basic, I'll say it, books that, didn't necessarily resonate with me. And so this book right here, that book right there, was a book that I have spent so much time reading from and growing with. And why I say that is I found, well, and I've talked about it before, there's a technique. By the way, hi, I'm Shawn. Welcome to my podcast. You're here with me right now at the Haney House, built in, 1882 to 1890-ish by a man named Thomas Haney and his family, who came here to, well, at the time wasn't anything perhaps other than, whatever it was, but Maple Ridge was definitely a name brought in later. But anyways, you're joining me at a family home of his where he lived for many, many years. Well, this area of British Columbia was supposedly being cultivated for, modern civilization. So welcome. Thank you for joining me. So as I was saying, I wanted to kind of, talk about this particular book that I was reading and that I've read several times because I truly do believe there is so much knowledge that we can perhaps learn from. And it's not just knowledge in one book, for example, such as the Bible, where stories or information regarding, those aspects of life that we choose to bring into our field that are important. There's also other books, I believe, and through discernment, often we can take or utilize many different types of books in order to bring that stuff into our field. And it doesn't necessarily have to be about, always finding that accurately perfect information, because allowing ourselves to be open to the possibility that information, that may help us grow to be better can be essentially found in many different directions. And this particular book series, although I have invested a considerable amount of time, I've never claimed it to be the epitome of everything that I am. And I find that when we limit ourselves to one book being the truth, rather than recognizing that perhaps, that book did have other stories or intentions behind it. And so that's something that was actually pretty interesting recently that I had this conversation with a friend of mine, and we were talking about the Bible, and he was essentially sharing with me a story from his version of the Bible. And why I say his version of the Bible is, if you don't know, there are like so many different versions of the Bible. It's been rewritten so many times by different people, different organizations, different groups for different reasons. The Bible itself, well, most people perhaps will read it in English. The Bible, as I've come to understand it, was written in a different language. And in fact, English is an imaginary language, a language created for, a global community to be able to communicate. The original language, for example, of England wasn't English. And at least that's how I'm coming to understand the overall, scope of our history. That the Saxons, the original people that perhaps were part of England, that they spoke Saxon. And, there were other influences in that area as well, Norwegian and, Danish and Viking. And there was a lot of other people. And actually, in a story that I had heard from my friend when we were talking about the Bible, was that English was perhaps a language that was created at a port in order to help all of the people communicate and to be able to work together. And so when we look at books such as, the Bible, for example, it is a translated book. It is translated, and with translation, of course, you hold the perspectives and the ideas, even the filters, definitely, of the people who translated it. And then those who accept it and, bring it into their lives, they're doing so with their own understandings of that translation. So small words like duh from Latin or Chinese, which mean of, could be translated in many different ways, giving credence to the idea that perhaps there is a more complete version of that text. There was the Gnostic discoveries, or I think they were called the Hagamadi texts, that were found in some sort of jar in some sort of barren wasteland, hidden for, future generations to find. And even those particular texts, regardless of how we feel about them, they could honestly hold valuable information about, well, about the truth of reality, or even the truth of just that one Bible, that one text. Actually, there was I don't know if it's a secret, but there was an explanation about the King James version, I believe, of the Bible. And it had said, or the person who was talking to me on the video had said that actually, no, it was Bashar who said, I believe it was Bashar. But anyways, regardless of who said it, the idea fascinated me. It had said, in order to perhaps understand the true history of humanity, is to take the King James version of the Bible, and instead of representing individual characters within that story or that narrative of the Bible, to replace those individual characters perhaps with races or groups of beings, and therefore to reread it in a different light. And maybe one day when, I move towards where I'm going, I'll sit back and read that, or maybe in an epiphany, the whole thing will just come to me. And actually, when I say that word epiphany, it gets me into thinking exactly what happened to me when I was discussing the Bible with my friend. And see, for me, I've always been challenged with the even the word Bible, because it represented, or was a term that was derived from the religious organizations out there that gave, full belief and full trust, and that their version of the Bible, and at that time I wasn't aware of how many different versions of the Bible there was, but with their version of the Bible, they believed their version was the true one. And yet, how do we live in a world where everyone has their own version of a text, and their version is somehow superior to all others? And, that gave me the idea, or the epiphany, as I was saying, that, maybe it's that whatever version of the Bible or the holy texts that we all hold, as long as they are of God, they do all hold, seeds and truth within them. And regardless of the rewrites that fit the narrative of the day or the religion that they were meant for, that regardless of all that, the actual fundamental morals and stories and ideas, and when I say stories, I really do mean stories, because as my own research has shown, a lot of these stories that we have within these different Bibles are essentially, and I mean holy texts, not Bible specifically, but a lot of these stories are the same, just changing out the characters' names for someone else's names, and, you know, changing parts that perhaps fit the story better and rephrasing it in a way that, you know, it would better suit purposes and intentions, and, you know, even just translational errors and such, you know. Anyways, so I had that idea that perhaps there is truth in all of them, and I was able therefore to let go of that mistrust in the word Bible, not in the actual book itself, because I recognize the moral importance of a lot of what's said in there, not the fear mongering and the, you know, apocalypse, or the versions of the Bible where God is this being that would do bad things to his children. You know, there's a difference definitely between purposely creating devastation and harming your children versus allowing what is happening to happen because it was the consequences of their own personal actions. Like, there's a difference in discrepancy there. So while I can understand, you know, some of these stories and how they came to be, especially when the ruling class was utilizing this particular book. Did you know at one time the Bible wasn't even available for the common person to read because our languages were different? And at that time, at least how as I understand history, that the Bible was in Latin, or a very, you know, educational or highly taught language that the most of the public didn't have access to. And we simply had to accept what we were being told that were in the pages of the book. And at some point, that when people say, "Oh, I have my truth and that person has their truth and that has their truth." Well, how I've come to see that idea of truth is that's another person's perception, and that truth is only truth and remains truth regardless of who, you know, adds their perception or their translation to it. So that talk that I had with my friend about the Bible and about his story that he was telling within his Bible, of where he came to truly connect fully, or at least connect enough to enter that particular religion, we'll call it. Or maybe to him it's not a religion, but nonetheless, to that, you know, religious group, because that's still, I guess, how I see all and most types of religion, is when you're required to read a certain book and to subscribe to a certain, you know, philosophy, and limiting perhaps the exploration of outside of it, and paying tidings, and, you know, having to go somewhere to a building every Sunday, for example, to pledge allegiance to what you believe in. That has always challenged me, because for me, I believe that God is everywhere. Like, God right now is in this house, is in the nature around me, is within me. It's within the camera and the microphone that I'm speaking through. It's, and I say it's, as, you know, I'm challenged sometimes to personify God as He, because I do feel that God is everything, the source of everything. And, you know, when I came across this particular book series called I Am the Word, a lot of what was being talked about in the book, you know, it resonated with me. It allowed me to connect all of these smaller little pieces that previously, through my exploration, and I'll admit a lot of my exploration was done through movies. I would watch movies that, such as The Passion of Christ, or, you know, other movies or TV series such as The Vikings had a lot of, you know, Saxons and the original formation of Christianity across the English speaking world. And of course, I learned that, you know, that English wasn't even the language that those people spoke, and that a lot of things that we understood about our history were perhaps, you know, misconstrued because of our dependence upon learning from movies and TV shows rather than going out into the real world ourselves. And so even I had the opportunity in 2003 to walk upon the original China Wall, the original Great Wall that stood in between, the Russian area and the Mongolian, or I don't know if it was between China and Mongolia, or China and, the northern Russian part. And so, I was able to actually stand within the historical area and discern for myself what I believed, rather than, just accepting that everything that I heard on the movies or the internet was, in fact, truth. And so that's part of my, one of my series called Journeys, where I wish to journey all over this planet and share all of these beautiful different places with everyone who chooses to come along with me. And whether that's in form, or, it's just watching my videos and supporting me and my exploration of our beloved planet through, different sources like Patreon or PayPal. And anyways, so today I kind of wanted to share with you the prologue, or the introduction to this particular book, and then maybe, kind of jump into an explanation a little bit. So I hope that this microphone is actually picking up my voice, and I trust it is. And so, yeah, today I'm going to read from, find the prologue, not the whole thing, just a little bit. Okay. So we're on page 17, and we're reading a little bit from this book here. Prologue. In the beginning. We're ready for this, and this is a call to action. And we would say a call to action because the docile nature of your being would prefer you to stay asleep, but this is no longer available to you. The times have changed, and the time for recognition of yourselves as a divine being has come. Period. Once you understand that on a higher level, your frequency is one with your creator, everything seems to change. Once you understand that the availability of this energy that we will call the Christ is available to you, to all, everything changes. Once you understand that the sonship, your Son of God self, is who you truly are, everything changes. If you are aware of this already on a minor level, you can get to an understanding that the heavens are about to open to you. When you have an understanding that this is the time of this coming age of Christendom, everything changes. When you believe that you are one with the Christ, everything changes. Now we ask you questions now. Why did you come here? Why did you come to this land to incarnate in a body and to be realized as a person? Why did you come? Why did you come? Why did you come? This is a question for today. Why you come back into a body and have experienced that will move you to this way and that, upwards and downwards, and through a lifetime. Why did you do it? Why did you come? Now we will tell you, and we will tell you very simply. Why you have come is to realize yourself as the Christ itself that you were intended to be. This is the mission of man. That is the mission of every man. That is the mission that you have bequeathed, that you have been bequeathed, and that you have been answering to, each one of you in your own way, as you transpire to move through this time. Now, no one is without this promise that the Christ itself will be realized within you to the extent that you align to its vibration. That is the promise. How does this happen? How does the Christ manifest itself in man? How does one become himself as Christ? That is the mission of this book. That is the action of this book. And that is the teaching of this book that we will give you. Those of you who have come to this place of reading are already aware that times are significant, and that which you believe is to be true is falling away as the veil falls away from the clouds. Now we will say this. Now we will say to you this. When the veil falls away, what is revealed finally is truth. When the truth is revealed, the recognition of it comes quickly, and you'll begin to understand through the process of experiencing this book that you are that what you are is the Christ embodying himself as man. That is your job. That is the teaching. Then that is why you are here. And that is why you have come here to this reading and to experience yourself as Christ. Now, many of you are going to ask, what does this mean? What am I then? What does it mean to be the Christ? And we will tell you very simply, what it means to be the Christ is to be in frequency of Christ and to recognize the self in the divinity as one with the Creator, without the separation of the self that the ego process would keep in place to diminish the glory of the self as the one with its Creator. Now, once you understand that the Christ is, in essence, the vibration of God as realized in man, and that it will be recognized and awakened and made manifest, you will begin to believe that everything is possible in this world. You will understand that the possibility of this begins with you, period. You are the safety of this action. You are the one who chooses it. You are the one who allows for it, and you are the one who believes it can be true. To the extent that you align to this energy that we deem the Christ is to the extent to which you will become aligned to your own self in your own glory. And once this has transpired, your frequency has adjusted itself to the high vibration when all things are in resonant with God. Now, when we say this, we are not speaking metaphorically. We are not giving you a symbol. We are not giving you a lie. We are not going to tell you that a man can become Christ in truth if this is not the case. In fact, the lie is that you are not Christ, and it's always been a lie. You have been given permission to realize the self in fullness. You have been given permission to self-identify as the Christ, and you have been given permission to realize that this can be so. We have given it to you. It has been given to you by others. The message of the Christ teaching was this incompleteness, and it has been regarded as something other, as a parable for far too long. The understanding of the self as the Christ brings to it the Christ. And once the Christ is merged with the soul that it is created in, miracles occur. I take a brief pause right there because it's been a long time that I've been reading this book. Actually, I started reading it in, I guess, about 3 or 4 years ago. And like I said, from the first time that I read the book, there felt so much resonant frequency with it. And at that time, I didn't fully understand a lot of things about, religion overall. I understood, for instance, some religions claimed there was a being called Jesus Christ. Actually, there's a lot of beings who talked about Jesus, but when I knew that name Jesus, I knew the name Jesus. I didn't know the rest of the name. I didn't see, or hear Jesus Christ as if Christ was a family name. And so when I first read that book, it suddenly resonated to me that, oh, well, there's something here. There's something within these pages. So I'm going to read through it. And, when I first started reading through it, I read slowly because I was challenged at not just what it was saying, but more importantly, that it became challenging to even comprehend the terminology, the phrasing, the wording, the flow. At that time, I was just, we'll call it awakening spiritually. Yeah, before that, I had my awakening, to the reality of the illusion that we live in. But yet, that spiritual aspect was, the more important light that I was following when I started reading this book. And I don't mean following as in, getting breadcrumbs and going wherever the breadcrumbs grow. I mean, really looking into, researching, analyzing, contemplating, pondering, wondering, sitting within moments of solitude, just considering what could be. And the more and more I read through these books, and, this was an original passage, as I said, from the original book. But yet, as I got more immersed within all of the other texts, and as I said, there's 12 of them, I began to, find myself on a journey seeking spiritual truth. And then also looking into other texts, into other versions of the Bible, as well as, into channeled texts. There's one that I truly did appreciate being connected with, and that was called The Essenes. And that's a book, or it's called Jesus and the Essenes, and it's a book or a channeled text by Dolores Cannon. And I found that, I was on a journey to find my own truth rather than just, blindly accept what I was grown up into. See, I had an experience of when I was grown up that I was, of course, as everyone else was, brought up into going to Sunday school every year as a child or every day as a child. But yet I didn't feel an alignment to be there. And when I had a traumatic experience when I was 13, I stepped away from all religions. And it was a very painful experience that I went through. And it essentially made me question, is there a God? And through my own experience, I learned that, or not learned, but I connected with my own version of God rather than following a religious dogma or doctrine telling me what their version of God was. And I never really truly even understood that some religions revere Jesus Christ as a God, because to me, Jesus was and has always been a being that held so much wisdom. And as I've went through my own experience, I started realizing that wisdom isn't something that's taught. Wisdom is something that, some people call a gut feeling or intuition or a cognition. It's a connection with, what some would say is knowledge, that it's almost as if it was an epiphany. And it definitely is or derived from experience and knowledge, because, those things get us to where we're going. But wisdom for me is that moment where something just clicks into place, or an idea of something magnificent, or anyways, we all have our own ideas of wisdom is. I've done a podcast in the past where I differentiated between what I thought wisdom and knowledge were. And while I have updated my ideas and thoughts since then, I definitely subscribe to the fact that wisdom and knowledge hold different values and different ideas, and perhaps, they are different. And maybe they're partly the same. Who knows? Like I said, I'm not ever trying to tell someone how they should believe. I'm just sharing, ideas and experiences in this particular passage of the book. And how I've come to understand this whole idea of Christ is, some would even call it or rephrase it as crystalline energy. Or as the book points it out, it's a frequency, it's a resonant energy, perhaps, or a resonant frequency, which we can align to. And that perhaps the truth of Jesus is that he was or is, more importantly, a being that found a divine truth and was willing to share this information first with the people that he grew up with. And the interesting thing that I came to understand is that when he came back to his hometown or his home village, that those people there, they didn't necessarily believe or even witness the things that he was doing and saying, because they had a perception and a belief. And maybe that's what, the original projection was, that he could do things, but because they didn't believe it was possible, because they believed they knew who he was, seeing him grow up, regardless if it was him with the Essenes or him within his own village people, that he was unable to demonstrate those abilities. Because I do really, I guess you could say, align with the idea that we co-create our reality, that we all play a part in essentially the fruition or the realization of what we see in the world around us. And that for us to truly perhaps change our world, I kind of see that it has to be first within, and then collectively we come together and we create the world that we resonate with. Another powerful insight that I have come to understand is that our lives are perhaps a factor or a product. Yes, a product. Our lives are perhaps a product of the five closest time people that we spend time with. That we collectively in our lives, those people who truly are a major, investment in our existence, in our talking, in our conversations and discussions, that those people, those five, are what we create our reality from, leading me to understand that should we stay in an environment where those people around us that we spend most of our time with are naysaying and criticism and you know what I mean, but if they are people that we don't necessarily resonate with, that when we spend our time and we invest our energy, that maybe we're wasting it, not wasting it in the sense of a bad investment, but I mean that it's leaking, maybe even is a good way to say it. And so over these past 3 years, I have spent a lot of time reading these books, spending my time with these books, as opposed to investing them in social relationships. I don't necessarily go out to, bars or clubs, and I spend a lot of time in solitude, not in isolation, because I have the opportunity living in a city to walk around and immerse myself within social activities. At a time, I would often spend a lot of time going to and supporting the local businesses and restaurants in my own, we'll call it supersized town. And, talking with people when they asked me about what I was reading, because I would often carry the books that I was reading. I would go to the massage called Big Feet, had an amazing group of acupuncture specialists and reflexology specialists. And I would read my book while I was receiving the medical practice that they were sharing with me. And occasionally people would ask me, well, what are you reading? What's it all about? And I would, share it from the understanding that I had at that time. And yet, as I repeatedly read and listened to these books, which are available on Audible, I would therefore get a greater understanding through the practice of spaced repetition, another powerful tool that I had learned in order to truly pull out the powerful aspects of what I was reading, and sometimes even find that the book that I was reading, although I had listened to it and read it several times, it felt as if it was a new book, because perhaps in the past I had, succumbed to distortions or just got distracted and missed a step of what I was reading, or even just, looking at a new sentence in a new line of time, I was able to grab more insight, because every step forward that we move, we are in essentially a new and redefined version of ourselves. And in most cases, we are, elevated to a new space, especially when we're very thoughtful upon who and where and what we spend our time in investing in. And so when we spend our time in things of, enlightenment or moral strength and even Aesop fables, things like that, and uplifting movies, they truly do help us redefine who we are. And when we avoid movies that show or demonstrate horrific events such as war and unnecessary violence and impractical humor where people get hurt and other people are laughing, or horror movies. Horror movies are by far the one of the worst things, in my opinion, that we can use with our free time, that we can invest our free time in, because our brain works to a degree that it doesn't really fully comprehend that when we're looking at something and we're looking from the first person's perspective of, that character on Nightmare on Elm Street or Jason or whoever it is that we're watching, it doesn't understand what we're watching, and therefore it is in essentially experiencing that fear and bringing those negative images and perception into our reality, so that when we go out at night and we're alone walking down the street, we essentially participate in our own creation of that reality, leading to sometimes perhaps those unfortunate events that we would prefer not to happen. And although, you can look at it and say, well, I grew from that, maybe we did. But I believe that we are moving into a space where perhaps we can learn to a greater degree our lessons and our growth and, the aspects of our experience from more of a God's choice of choice. Meaning that rather than having to choose between a low polarity and a high polarity, that we could perhaps learn our lessons from, positive attributes all around. And making those choices of rather than to eat or not to eat, it would be, well, what do I want to eat rather than what do I have to eat, if that makes sense. And so this particular reading that I'm reading from, well, I do and have grown from a lot of what I'm read in this book, and I probably will continue to discuss this. It doesn't necessarily mean that what I'm reading is the end all truth, because truth is a perception. And even other books written in other languages that I have yet to read hold valuable understandings of the truth of our reality. And the one truth that remains true is essentially God's truth. And when I say God's truth, I don't mean a book. I don't mean a church. I don't mean, certain sitting in a certain direction and having to do that in that direction. And by no means am I criticizing any of that. I'm just explaining for me what truth is that direct connection, that feeling, that gut instinct, that insight, that epiphany, that cognition, that those are more in alignment with truth. And yet, to get there, yes, we have all those other paths, those other books, those other videos, such as even this one, or all of the other videos that have essentially been recommended to me in my feed by YouTube. And when I'm watching them, many of them I have immediately, banned the channel, or there's a little button on YouTube, if you have an account with YouTube, that you can essentially click on that and say, do not recommend this channel. And I utilize that to remove all of the mainstream media out of my YouTube feed. And for a while, I did subscribe or even watch a lot of these AI channels. But as I started seeing the AI channels sometimes even like expose themselves as, copy pasted scripts, I even got rid of those channels and I began to limit my, exposure, allow those channels that wanted to find their way into my stream to be there, because I have essentially disallowed hundreds of YouTube channels from coming into my feed. And when I see a YouTube channel that is, promoting fear through the thumbnail or the coloring of the videos, thumbnail, or even the triggering or the clickbait titles that they would use, or how they would start the video off, I essentially got rid of them as well. And so now I've been able to essentially mold my sources of information into a selected few where I can truly thrive and practice that discernment in a greater field of unity, cohesiveness, and clarity, essentially. And so, yeah, there's a lot to be said about what I read, and I'll even look at it more, but perhaps going back in for yourself to re-listen to essentially that part. I will in the future create a chapter title or a chapter that you can therefore just go back and click on that. But for now, perhaps just scroll back and re-listen to that and, consider what you believe and why you believe what you believe. And is there room to perhaps explore something different? Because in the future, I would love to get together with people who are either reading this book, these books, or would love to explore this book. And whether it's in a retreat or a workshop or, visiting Paul Selig himself in one of his readings around the world, I would love to, explore these ideas as well as explore the other ideas in the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, wherever it is, because I do believe there is a large amount of truth within almost every aspect of knowledge that's on this planet. And yet the truth of it all perhaps is that wisdom remains the truest. And we receive that wisdom when we clear away through becoming aware of the deception, of the fact that many stories have been rewritten and characters have been changed out in order just to, contrive a narrative for the organization that was utilizing that previously used or previously written text. So, anyways, thank you so much for sharing your time and intention with me. I trust and I bless and I love God, and I know that I am equally loved, blessed, and known by God. And yeah, thank you so much. I look forward to sharing more time with you in the coming future, the coming moments of now, as we step forward into this glorious, glorious, revealed new earth that has perhaps always been around us and yet was just slightly beyond our veil. Have a wonderful day. Love you so much, and I'll see you soon.